What's up, addicts? Welcome to the Fantasy Addiction Network. Don't mind me. I'm just doing a little dance because I started a Chubb hunt. And Boyd tonight, very happy about tonight's game between the Browns and the Bengals. Terrific game, right? Like, fantasy football, the best part about fantasy football is you care about games that otherwise you'd have no interest in watching. But watching the Bengals and Browns duke it out on a Thursday night can't really get much better than that, especially when it's actually a good game and there's a lot of scoring being done. If you had watched my risers and fallers video, you'd know that I was still in on Nick Chubb, was buying Nick Chubb, and that's the exact reason why the Ravens gave us an anomaly game, but the Browns improved offensive line. They really wanted to run the ball like they did tonight, so Nick Chubb looks to be in a really good spot. I understand there's probably going to be people recommending that you sell high on him after this performance, but I'm going to keep riding it. If you guys look at the Browns' schedule, it's really easy for the most part. You know, they do play the Steelers one time, but their other game against the Steelers is in week 17. So you really only have the Steelers and the Ravens on the schedule. That's pretty murky. Other than that, it's a pretty good schedule. So I'm ecstatic if I own Kareem Hunt. I'm ecstatic if I own Nick Chubb after tonight. But yeah, we'll get more into that later. In this video, we are doing the rest of the start-sit videos in terms of all of the afternoon games, the Sunday night game, the Monday night game, talking about all those wonderful start-sit decisions that we're going to have to choose between. Some interesting games here. You know, we'll talk about the lines in each of the games as well. You know, there's quite a few high over-unders here that I think are kind of fraudulent. I don't really see as much upside here with some of these later games as Vegas is portraying. So we're going to have to kind of sift through the weeds a little bit in this one and figure out what is actually the best approach here. But you know, like we normally do, we'll go game by game. If you guys have questions, feel free to hit me up in the live chat. I'll get to them in between videos since I actually go through and chop these up and post them. Not going to be answering questions for those portions, but I'll get back to them as soon as I can. But yeah, so let's get into this right away, though, and let's start by looking at the first afternoon game on the slate, Washington football team versus the Arizona Cardinals. Last week, both of these teams with a surprise win, beating the spread against themselves in both of these games. You know, both of these teams are projected to start 0-1. Cardinals beat the 49ers. Washington beats the Eagles and, you know, put on a pretty good showing defensively, whereas the Cardinals did their magic offensively. So this could be a very interesting showing. We're going to see which team is more for real here, you know, whether Washington actually has a more dominant defense than we've been expecting up to this point, or is the Cardinals offense being led by Kyler Murray and DeAndre Hopkins really that potent? So we'll find out. But in terms of what Vegas is expecting, they're expecting there to be some more points scored in this one. 46.5 over under, one of the higher ones on the week. Cardinals are projected to win by 6.5, giving us a spread of roughly 26-20 there for the Cardinals. Now, again, you know, as we mentioned in our video yesterday, and we'll keep updating these points against totals as the season goes on, but with only one data point right now, it doesn't really mean too much for us. Obviously, with Washington having a pretty strong game against Carson Wentz last week, pretty much the only place that they gave up points was to the tight ends. Obviously, that was with Ertz and Goddard going off. So, you know, that's a little bit ambiguous. We're not starting Dan Arnold because of that. And then the Cardinals gave up that massive play to Raheem Mostert, gave up a lot of running back points, but overall, they looked a little bit better against the run than we expected them, so we're not looking into these lines too much. What does matter more is just based on our preseason analysis, what we've seen in terms of the one game that we have and trying to turn that into a narrative that makes sense. So looking at both of these teams here, I'm not expecting this game to go as high scoring as Vegas is saying right now. I didn't like what Washington did on offense really at all last week. The only reason that they were even in that game was because they kept forcing interceptions from Wentz pretty near the goal line, so they were able to have pretty short fields. Haskins started to look a little bit better as the game went on, but for the most part, the Washington football team was not very solid on offense. Now, the Cardinals defense probably is a little bit weaker than the Eagles, but I don't expect Washington to come out and light the world on fire. You're starting McLaurin. McLaurin still had a decent amount of targets and air yards in that game, and you know he has the potential to break out at any point. And then Logan Thomas, I believe he had the second most targets or team targets for a tight end across the NFL. So Logan Thomas has an interesting start here. George Kittle had an okay game last week, but the biggest reason there was the fact that he had that hyperextended knee pretty early on in the game before he was actually able to make any damage. And if we remember from last year, the Cardinals were very exploitable against the tight end position. So Logan Thomas is a very interesting tight end flex here, and someone that if you were able to pick him up off the waiver wire, if you own George Kittle and you're worried, that George Kittle won't go, which I would believe at this point, I would venture to guess that George Kittle won't play. Logan Thomas is a really nice bench stash you can keep on your team and pivot to in case Kittle gets declared out on Sunday morning. I think Thomas will have a pretty decent game here. Now, in terms of the rest of the options here, I still personally like Antonio Gibson in the backfield more than any other running back on this team. And if I had to start one, I would go with Gibson. He just looks far more explosive than any of the other guys there. The issue is obviously, is he going to get the goal line carries? Last week, obviously, Peyton Barber with the 2 goal line touchdowns there, but he didn't really add much with his touches at all. So I believe as this team becomes more, they trust Gibson with their touches more, Gibson will see more and more of the workload, and Barber and McKissick will be phased out a bit more, but that might take a few more weeks, so I'm not really looking to jam anyone else in my lineup here. Steven Sims, only 3 receptions last week, had a really nice stretch to end last year, but didn't really continue that. Not sure if it's really worth even mentioning him unless you're like the deepest of deep leagues. Probably not even necessarily a guy you need to keep on your bench right now. And then the Washington defense, I'm not necessarily outright telling you to bench them. I do think that they're going to have a rougher time against Kyler Murray than they did last week against Carson Wentz. Kyler Murray is a bit more elusive, probably not going to be able to sack him as much. And then obviously having true offensive weapons like DeAndre Hopkins and Kenny Drake and Christian Kirk, a bit stronger than what the Eagles were coming out with them last week with broken offensive line and no Miles Sanders. So while they'll still probably get a few sacks, I don't think they're going to be scoring as many points this week. So tentatively looking at them, but probably not. And then Haskins, is pretty much a no-go at this point unless you're in the deepest of 2 quarterback leagues. Peyton Barber is literally just a shot at another potential goal line touchdown. I'm not going to take that shot with Barber. So on the Cardinals side, this one is going to be one of the easier teams, at least for now. We'll see what happens with the splits between Kenny Drake and Chase Edmonds, but Kenny Drake still looked pretty good on the touches that he got. Hopefully it maintains enough of that workload, enough of those weighted opportunities to continue to be putting out decent scoring. I mean, a lot of people were upset with Kenny Drake's output last week, but I mean, he still scored in like the top tier of running backs. He still had a touchdown, still had like 16, 17 PPR fantasy points. Like, I mean, that's all you can really expect sometimes. He played the 49ers, so I think Kenny Drake is still a really good start this week, even against that tough offensive line for Washington because of the work he gets out of the passing game. Of course, you're going to start Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray looks like he could definitely be taking that year 2 leap like we saw from Lamar Jackson. And then DeAndre Hopkins, goodness, my 14 targets last week, absolutely insane amount of target share for this team. If he continues that, I mean, he's going to be in the running for the number 1 receiver on the year. So, of course, you're jamming Hopkins into your lineup, and I think the Cardinals defense is actually a sneaky play here. Dwayne Haskins looked bad last week, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Cardinals can sneak a few turnovers in this one, potentially get a few sacks on him. Now, the interesting plays come down to when we talk about like Chase Edmonds and Christian Kirk. Obviously, Chase Edmonds got the touchdown last week, but he didn't really get enough carries or targets out of the backfield to really warrant a flex start at this point yet. I'm not going to be pivoting over to Chase Edmonds until we see a little bit more. And then Christian Kirk, I mean, last week he was kind of a sacrificial lamb playing alongside the side where Richard Sherman was to keep Hopkins free, but I don't really know that they're going to be featuring Christian Kirk too much. If you're playing him, it's almost going to end up being more like a boom bust shot every single week. And at this point, I'm going to wait and see until Christian Kirk has a good game before I jam him into my lineup. Probably not going to be starting Larry Fitzgerald or Dan Arnold anytime soon either. In terms of prediction in this one, I think the Cardinals will win this one pretty easily. I have them winning 21-13 in their home opener against the Washington football team. Okay, jumping over to one of the highest over-unders on the slate this week, we have the Ravens versus the Texans. Now, this one is in Houston, but I would be remiss to not mention the last time these guys played. I believe the final score was like 41-6, 41-7. Ravens absolutely crushing the Texans. That one was in Baltimore, but That was also at the point in time when the Texans had DeAndre Hopkins. So I'm worried about this one. This one doesn't make sense to me in terms of the over-under. So they're giving this a 50-point over-under, second highest on the week, only behind the Falcons and Cowboys game. The implied point total right now is 28.5 for the Ravens, 21.5 for the Texans, with the Ravens getting a -7-point spread. Obviously, the Ravens dominated on defense last week playing against the Browns, and we saw the Browns come out and have a much better offensive showing tonight. So we'll see whether that speaks more to the Ravens just having a really good defense again, or if it was just a sputtering start for the Browns. But we know that the Ravens have a very strong set of players on defense. They were very cohesive last year, very strong in that regard, and I wouldn't be surprised if they were so again against the Texans. Now, the Texans looked a little bit disjointed on offense last week against the Chiefs. They had a couple nice drives and you put together some garbage time points for you, but for the most part, they played really sloppily against the Chiefs last week. Deshaun Watson was not going deep very much at all. Will Fuller was pretty much the only guy that he ended up targeting towards the end of the game. David Johnson looked decent, had some nice runs against the Chiefs, but once they started getting routed, they had to abandon the run and go to the pass game. I'm concerned for the Texans' prospects whenever they have these kind of games, because if they go down really quickly, I don't know that they have the firepower to actually be able to hang with the Ravens. So in terms of this over-under, I'm a little bit skittish about what it actually means for the Texans. I'm surprised that spread is only 7 for the Ravens. I think there's a little bit of carryover and bleed over from what we expect the Texans to be based on previous seasons, and I just don't believe that anymore. So in terms of who we're starting this week, the Ravens are easy. You're starting Lamar, you're starting Marquise, you're starting Mark Andrews, and you're starting the Ravens defense. Even if this is a high-scoring game, the Ravens defense should get plenty of sacks, plenty of opportunities for interceptions. Deshaun Watson is always good for 1 or 2 of those, and hopefully you get one of those run back for a pick 6. Now, the biggest question mark here is, what do you do with that run game? Mark Ingram had more carries than J.K. Dobbins last week, but J.K. Dobbins was actually on the field for more snaps than Mark Ingram. Obviously, he was the one that came away with the 2 touchdowns, involved more in the passing game, and Mark Ingram wasn't really involved in the passing game all that much last year. He did have a lot of passing touchdowns, but it wasn't like he had a high market share of targets for this team. So this is a very concerning situation if you drafted Mark Ingram early. I'm a bit worried about what this actually means for his prospects going forward. I've been a huge fan of J.K. Dobbins ever since the Ravens drafted him, and I feel like he is eventually going to be able to take over a pretty big workload here, but Greg Roman has basically been telling us that the usage split for these running backs is going to change every week. He keeps saying it over and over again, and I don't think that we should assume that he's lying to us because we came out and were surprised week 1. Don't be surprised if the same thing happens in week 2. So am I completely pivoting off of these guys? No. I mean, there's plenty of better or worse plays that I would play Ingram or Dobbins over. I think Dobbins probably carries a little bit more upside, but if I had to choose between one or the two, I'd probably go with Ingram one more time until we see that they're going to be using Dobbins like this every single week. Because again, with the way that they're talking, it's going to change every week. I think Ingram could definitely have a good game this week, and I wouldn't be surprised at all. I know a lot of people would be at this point, but personally, if you have both of these guys or if you have one or the other, I would try to find a better matchup play here and just wait this situation out until it becomes a little more clear, whether that is due to someone getting traded away or someone suffering an injury and they're not as viable in the offense anymore. Until we have a little bit more clarity here, this is going to be a really annoying situation to figure out, akin to the Patriots of past. So I would try to avoid them if at all possible. And then Boykin and Snead definitely are decent GPP plays in DraftKings, but not someone I'm throwing into my lineup in a season-long league. So on the Texans side, of course you're going to start David Johnson. He looked really good, and even if the Ravens rout the Texans, I think he'll be involved enough in the passing game that he'll still have a pretty decent baseline there. And then Will Fuller, I mean, there's no way you can bench him after the amount of targets and receptions he had last week against the Chiefs. So I like both of those guys as strong plays this week. Now, where it gets interesting is Deshaun Watson. Last year, when Deshaun Watson played the Ravens, he had 165 passing yards, no touchdowns, 1 interception, and 11 rushing yards. It was a terrible, completely destroyed, lost you your week kind of game from Deshaun Watson. He is prone to do that. If you look back, he buoys a lot of his fantasy points on the year with some big blow-up games, And he has a few of these absolute stinkers where, unless he comes back and gets you some garbage time, it's a really bad week. And I'm afraid that could potentially happen again this week. So while I still think the upside is there for Watson, especially with this higher over-under, if you have another option that you're comfortable with starting, I would potentially throw Deshaun Watson on my bench in this one. Yes, we have seen them come out and play well in tough games like they did against the Patriots last year, and the fact that they're in Houston might change things a little bit. So I'm not telling you absolutely have to bench Deshaun Watson. I'm just giving you the potential warning signs here, the red flags that I'm seeing playing the Ravens. I would be a little bit hesitant to throw Watson into my starting lineup. And then all the ancillary pieces, Duke Johnson, Brandon Cooks, Randall Cobb, Kenny Stills, Darren Fells, Jordan Akins, like all these guys, I'm very nervous about the touch distribution. The only people that we saw last week that had any semblance of decent usage was David Johnson and Will Fuller. I'm not going to be risking throwing any of those other guys in my lineup until we see trends. So at this point, if you own any of these guys, we're just waiting and trying to see what the trend is. But in terms of my projection for this one, I have the Ravens blowing the Texans out 35-16. Might still get some decent garbage time there, but that's kind of leading into my hesitancy to start Deshaun Watson here. Okay, let's jump over and talk about the Chiefs and the Chargers. Another interesting game on this slate, and I think a lot of people are hesitant to start people in this one because of the fact that the Chargers were so dismal on offense, but pretty strong on defense last week. Of course, you're starting the Chiefs. I meant more so like starting Chargers, and I get the hesitancy there, but pretty high over-under, 47.5. Chiefs are slated to win this one by about 8.5 points. Now, historically, the Chiefs and Chargers have played themselves pretty tough. Even with Patrick Mahomes here, we've seen them trade off some wins back and forth. And I think this ends up being a little bit of a closer game. I don't necessarily believe enough in Tyrod Taylor to think that he's going to be able to give this team, a massive fantasy output. But I think this is a better week for the Chargers than it was last week facing against the Bengals. Because, that offense didn't have to do a lot because they were able to slow the Bengals down completely. This defense is not going to be able to stop Patrick Mahomes. No defense can really do that at this point. So the Chargers are going to have to score points if they want to have any shot at winning this game. So that makes our starts a little bit easier. You probably don't even need me to run this back for you, but if you have Mahomes, you have Clyde Edwards-Helaire, you have Tyreek Hill, you have Travis Kelce, you're starting all of them. And I'm also very comfortable starting the Chiefs defense in this one. We saw last week that they still have, a very potent pass rush, and the way that Tyrod Taylor played last week, I think the Chiefs defense could actually be a pretty decent play here. Now, Sammy Watkins is probably the bigger question mark after coming out and playing pretty well in week one. We've seen him do this before. He plays really good in week one, and then it has like a little bit of a disappearing act, or last year, a massive disappearing act where he wasn't really startable for the rest of the season. But the other thing to note here is this trend actually began back in the playoffs from last year. Sammy Watkins had 3 decent games in the playoffs, was used pretty heavily in that Super Bowl run, and it continued into week one. So I am not saying that Sammy Watkins is a must bench. I'm just a skeptical fantasy owner that knows what Sammy Watkins has done for many years in a row, and I'm nervous about throwing him back into my starting lineup, but he could still end up being a pretty decent play, especially if he continues to see a high target share, or when they play against teams that just do their best to completely shut down Tyreek Hill, Sammy Watkins runs a little bit more open. So if you're in a bind, I don't think that Sammy Watkins is like a must bench by any means. Just someone I would at least lower my expectations until he shows that he can do it for a couple weeks. We're not starting Darrell Williams. Mecole Hardman, at this point, you can't trust him in your lineup at all. He only saw like 13% of snaps last week, and I'm not riding him at any point until we actually see him get some consistent usage. And then Demarcus Robinson looked like he didn't really belong on this team, even though he got a bunch of targets last week, so don't go chasing targets there. On the Chargers side, I'm going back to the well with Eckler. I know Eckler had a very disappointing showing in week one, but we just saw with Joe Mixon and Nick Chubb that just because you had a disappointing week one doesn't mean you can't rebound in week two. This is a better matchup. The Chiefs are more of a run funnel defense where they want you to run the ball against them, so that way they can defend the pass a bit better. Eckler has put up some pretty good stat lines against the Chiefs in the past as well. So if there's any game to start Eckler and regain your confidence in him, it's definitely this one. Now, Keenan Allen is someone that I'm very worried on in terms of the overall potential usage in this offense, I think it's still a decent start in this one. You drafted him to start him. You're going to put him back in your lineup one more time. If he ends up, bombing in this game, then you're probably going to keep him on your bench for a while. And then Hunter Henry had a pretty decent game last week. I would imagine he does the same this week. Josh Kelly is a name that, if you're in a deep league and you need to throw someone out there with the potential to have like a goal line touchdown, I think he's definitely an interesting name, but not someone I would go out of my way to start. And then Mike Williams, I mean, as we've already mentioned, the Chiefs are better at stopping the pass. The Bengals, we saw tonight, couldn't even slow Baker Mayfield down. So I wouldn't be throwing Mike Williams back out there just yet until we see if that is who Tyrod is actually going to go to more. I think this is more of a Keenan Allen game. Tyrod Taylor, I would only start in the absolute desperate situation here. And of course, you're never going to be starting a defense against the Chiefs. I have the Chiefs winning this one pretty handily, but maybe you could expect a bit more of a blowout, but I have them winning by 10. Chiefs 27, Chargers 17. All right, we got a few questions here. Should I start Singletary or Hines? That's a really good question. I'm going to assume you're talking about a PPR league. If you're talking about a PPR league, I would go Hines. Singletary and Zach Moss were both inefficient on the ground game last week, and Zach Moss was getting all the goal line carries. I don't know if there's something contractually obligated in Devin Singletary's contract that says that he can't ever receive goal line carries, but anytime you have a running back that is not being targeted very much and isn't getting goal line carries, that concerns me. I do think Singletary could have a decent game because the Dolphins defense isn't that great, but overall, I think at this point, Hines is the better play, especially against that Vikings defense that couldn't stop anything last week. So I would go Hines in that situation in PPR. And if it's not PPR, hopefully you have a different play, but I need to check my rankings to see if I have Hines or Singletary over there. I'd probably still go Hines. And then we have another question here: Melvin Gordon, Joshua Kelly, or Julian Edelman in non-PPR. I would probably go Melvin Gordon in a non-PPR. He doesn't have a great matchup. We talked about this in our video yesterday where we previewed the Broncos and the Steelers game. Obviously, the Steelers very strong against the run in New York, keeping Saquon Barkley at 6 yards. But, trying to anticipate each and every single week, the Broncos have a much better offensive line than the Giants do, and Melvin Gordon will also be involved in the pass game. Cortland Sutton is still a bit banged up, so they're going to have to rely on Melvin Gordon. Philip Lindsay out with that turf toe injury. So I would take the guaranteed volume with Melvin Gordon over a guy like Josh Kelly. And Julian Edelman is an interesting play. We're about to talk about him here, but in a non-PPR league, it's really hard to put a lot of faith in him, so I'd probably go Melvin Gordon in a non-PPR. And let's see. Yeah, so hopefully that answers your question there. If you have any follow-up, let me know. And then when we consider shopping Mixon after today's game, you know what? That's a very interesting question. And I actually saw a lot of good play from Mixon tonight. Obviously, the biggest concern if you watch tonight's game is the Bengals' offensive line is pretty bad. Now, we do know that the Browns' front seven, led by Myles Garrett, is pretty decent. So we were expecting it to be a little bit of a rough showing for the Bengals' offensive line, but they look pretty bad. That being said, Joe Mixon was really involved in the passing game tonight, and even though Giovanni Bernard was dead set on destroying his fantasy value, trying to steal that touchdown in the end, I saw a lot of promising things from Joe Mixon. And this is one of those teams that I expect the Bengals to get better as the season goes on. Joe Burrow looks very competitive, but he's still making some rookie throws. And as he gets more seasoned on this team, I would rather have Joe Mixon on my team headed down the stretch of the season rather than trading him away. If you can sell like really high, like if you could trade Joe Mixon for Jonathan Taylor, then I would do that. But overall, I don't think you're going to get value on Joe Mixon right now after, having a bad performance in week 1 and an okay performance in week 2. So it depends on what you mean by sell high. Like who are you actually getting for him? If you're not getting like a deal where you're getting either two really good players that help your lineup elsewhere, or a player that's better than Joe Mixon in your eyes and the other guy is just enamored by Mixon's talent, I probably would just hang on to Mixon. Let's see, Russell Wilson or Big Ben? That is also a great question. I'm going to go with Russell Wilson. They do both have, tough matchups against good defenses. I wouldn't be surprised if Big Ben has a really good week this week against the Broncos, considering AJ Bouye is out, but it's hard to bench Russell Wilson after what he showed us last week. Even though playing against the Patriots could be a little bit of a lower scoring game, I'd still take the shot at the upside with Russell Wilson because he still gives you a lot on the ground as well. And even if he doesn't have 4 touchdowns, he'll probably still find a way to at least put up 20, 25 points for you. I don't feel great about Marquez Valdes-Scantling. He's had these blow-up games and then completely disappeared in the past. And he was also, running. I think he only ran a route on like 63% of Aaron Rodgers' throws this last week, whereas Allen Lazard was out there for like over 80%. So I think he's still the clear number 3 outside of Devontae Adams and Allen Lazard. So I feel like you're chasing points with Marquez Valdes-Scantling. I wouldn't be trusting him until at least we see it a couple of times. If we're talking about like a DFS GPP play, I get it, like taking a shot on a guy that could potentially blow up, cool, but I'm not going to be taking that risk in like a season-long league. I think he's a bit of a mirage, and we'll probably see that play out after the Lions game. What do you think of David Johnson playing against the Ravens? Well, I actually just talked about that. So when the stream posts, you can actually go back and listen to my Ravens and Texans preview. But to answer your question quickly, I would still start him. Even if the Ravens rout the Texans, I think he'll be used enough in the passing game to at least get enough volume. So I think he's still like a top 15 play this week. Let's see. I have Allen Lazard as well. I mean, if I had to pick between Lazard and MVS, I'd probably take Lazard. Lazard, bullied the Lions last year in both of his games. And like if you're in a position where you have to start one of those guys, I would take Lazard over MVS. But I'm not really looking to jam either of those guys into my lineup. For me, it's still pretty much Rodgers, Adams, and Aaron Jones or bust. Okay. Yes, he did get 6 targets, but like I said, he wasn't running as many routes, and he also had a really bad drop, which tends to irk Aaron Rodgers, whereas Lazard caught all of his targets. And again, just seeing the usage on the field, it really does seem like Lazard is the clear 2 to me. So with Marquez Valdes-Scantling, you're really asking or hoping for like a big deep bomb, which could happen against the Lions. Not the greatest secondary there, but if it doesn't happen, you're probably going to be disappointed. So only reason I'd be starting MVS, like I said, would be like in a GPP where you're basically going for broke. Okay, let's jump over and talk about this game. Is really interesting. The game between the New England Patriots and the Seattle Seahawks. So very interesting debuts for both of these teams. The Seahawks come out and are top 5 in pass to run ratio, which is something that we never thought we would see. They were in command of that game the entire time. So is this going to be a trend that continues, or is that a 1-week anomaly? Was week 1 a mirage? That's going to be one of the biggest questions that needs to be answered this week. Whereas on the Patriots side, we saw Cam Newton come out and look pretty solid. He ran the ball really well. He was decent as a passer. Could have had a much better fantasy day if N'Keal Harry decided to, not throw the ball into the end zone and cause a fumble that led to a touchback. So I was very impressed by Cam Newton and obviously incredibly impressed by Russell Wilson. But the Patriots defense still looked pretty staunch. Now, yes, they were playing the Dolphins, who don't have a lot of firepower on their offense, but we saw last year the Patriots defense just came out and was a stonewall for fantasy points, but they didn't have to face an opponent like the Seahawks this early on. So something's got to give in this game. And when we actually look at the Vegas lines here, the way that they're projecting this is it seems like they're kind of confused too. This is at 45 over under, and the Seahawks are slated to win by 3.5. They are in Seattle. Seahawks are, implied roughly 24-21 would be the final score here. Now, like I said, the Patriots defense was really good last week, whereas the Seahawks didn't really do too much to stop Matt Ryan. They were just outscoring them, so it didn't really matter. And I think that might end up being a trend here. If the Seahawks defense, takes a step back, losing Jadeveon Clowney, but adding Adams as a safety there, did seem to keep their defense at least somewhat potent, but the Falcons were still able to pass all over them. So it's going to be a very, very interesting game that's going to tell us a lot of storyline. So we're kind of doing our best to read between the lines here, and I'm going to try to give you the best script that I can. So Cam Newton, I'm starting. Again, Matt Ryan was one of the better starts last week, and Cam Newton was pretty much unstoppable on the ground. So anytime you have a quarterback that's running the ball as well as Cam Newton was last week, he's always going to be in play for a top 5 option that week. Even if he doesn't throw very well, if he gets enough rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, he's going to have a very decent score. I'm still comfortable with starting James White. He didn't do as much last week as I was hoping for, but he looked pretty good and is still probably the second best option in terms of passing down plays. And then Julian Edelman, especially in PPR leagues, is a good play this week. He still saw the majority of the targets on his team, and I think this team will still funnel through him on passing downs, even though this is going to be a heavy run team. Now, Michel, I could talk myself into starting him, but he still just doesn't look good. Like, he hasn't looked good since the Patriots Super Bowl run where they beat the Rams. Like, that was the last time we saw Sony Michel actually look like a good football player. So I'm probably not rushing out to throw him into my lineup. I still think Damian Harris is probably a decent stash at this point and could end up being pretty good when he comes back. N'Keal Harry is someone I could see throwing into a lineup if you need like an upside play or you lost. If Jamison Crowder, A.J. Brown, Chris Godwin don't go this week and you have Harry on your bench, I could talk myself into starting them. And then the Patriots defense, it's just hard to play a defense against Russell Wilson because you never know when he's going to go off. But I could still see a way that they are a top performing defense this week. Whereas on the Seahawks side, I'm definitely starting Wilson for all the reasons I've already listed. Even against a tough defense, he still has enough ways to score fantasy points for you that I don't think he's going to completely dud. Chris Carson, low touch volume last week, involved in the passing game, 2 touchdowns, great, but only 6 carries, no goal line carries. A little bit nervous about him, but overall, if you're starting anyone here, I definitely think Carson is at least worth throwing out there again. Hopefully he gets another touchdown. Hopefully he gets more involved in this game as they reacclimate him coming back from that injury. I am a little nervous about Carson overall, but I think you can start him this week. And then here's where it gets interesting. So I have Metcalf and someone that I'm a little worried about. Overall, I still have him ranked decently high. My concern is we know that Bill Belichick's game plan typically is to take away your biggest option at just destroying him with like one single play. So anytime he plays a big-bodied receiver, anytime he plays a big-bodied tight end, someone that can just absolutely obliterate you in one play, he does his best to take that person out of the game. And if we're looking at the style play that Lockett plays versus Metcalf, history would tell us that the kind of guy that Bill Belichick would typically try to shut down would be Metcalf. So I would not be surprised if Metcalf is smothered and is the guy that Bill Belichick aims to take away from this game. Now, Metcalf had a really good game last week, but one of his big plays was on a busted coverage. The other one was where he was playing press coverage again off the line, which I don't understand why defenses keep doing that with Metcalf. You have to give him some space. They were doing that. They did that in college and it worked. Like, you got to go back to that. Well, Bill Belichick is a lot smarter than whoever's running the show over there in Atlanta these days. So I am concerned for DK Metcalf's upside. I think his floor is very low in this game, and if you have a better option, I would probably talk myself out of starting Metcalf this week. Of course, we're not starting Carlos Hyde, even though he was the guy that saw the goal line carries last week. Might be an anomaly. I think Chris Carson will probably see more of the goal line touches this week. And then Greg Olsen, 3 targets last week. He did get a touchdown, but he wasn't used very much, so probably only throwing him in if you absolutely have to. And then I'm nervous about starting either defense in this one for the potential of a shootout, even though I expect this to be a little bit lower scoring. So this is going to be a very telling game. I was going back and forth with how I feel this one will end, but I actually think the Patriots can win this one in the end. I think Bill Belichick can outmaneuver the offense of the Seahawks there, and I think Cam Newton gets it done for him. I got the Patriots winning this one by 1, but very close game overall and could go either way. Okay, let's see. What do we got? I feel like dropping Preston Williams, somehow the fantasy god is asking me to wait for Fitzmagic to happen. If I'm being honest with you, Fitzmagic might not happen, but Tua could come in and actually make things decent. Preston Williams played the Patriots last week. He's going to play the Bills this week, so he's going to start the season off with 2 really poor fantasy performances, which is not going to make your situation any easier, but he's still a hold for me. He looked pretty decent in the few routes that he was actually able to get open. Fitzpatrick was just missing him, and it was a really tough defense playing against them last week. So hang on, especially Devontae Parker dealing with that hamstring injury. Preston Williams might become the wide receiver 1 there, and their schedule does lighten up here in a few weeks. So I would hold at least for now with Preston Williams. James Conner Lockett. that's easy. Lockett 100% of the time. James Conner, even if he plays, I'm highly concerned with him. There's time and time again that he's come back from injury. He plays for like 1 or 2 series, re-injures something, goes back out, and then you never see him again. And he leaves you with like 2 fantasy points. So especially in a PPR league, I've got Lockett over Conner every single time. Let's see. Should I pick up AJ Brown or Corey Davis? If AJ Brown is on your waiver wire, you need to find a new league. You can pick up both. If AJ Brown doesn't play this week, I think Corey Davis becomes a fine start for a week or 2, but AJ Brown will be back. A knee bruise isn't something that typically keeps you limited for the rest of the season. It might be a rough week or 2 for AJ Brown, but eventually he'll get back to his dominant form. I have Michael Thomas. He's out. Kenny Golladay, Devonta Adams, and Darius Slayton. Should I drop one for Keelan Cole or N'Keal Harry? No. The only one that I would potentially think about is potentially dropping Harry for Lazard. I think those guys are pretty similar in terms of their value, but you're not dropping any of the other names that you mentioned. Darius Slayton just went off. Devonta Adams is going to be the number 1 receiver this year. Kenny Golladay will be fine when he comes back, and Michael Thomas is a hold unless you can sell high on him still. So there's no way you're dropping any of those guys for Keelan Cole is a mirage. Ignore him. And N'Keal Harry might be okay, but there's no way I'm dropping any of those guys for him other than maybe Lazard. Edelman is always questionable. Like, that's just his thing. Like, his last name should be changed to questionable. I think he was questionable for 16 weeks last year, and I think that's just like a Bill Belichick thing. I'm not sure why, but unless he's actually out, I'm starting him. Let's see. David Johnson against the Ravens is a little tough. I think he's gonna have a decent day. Yeah, I agree. Julian Edelman or Paris Campbell. Now that is actually an interesting one. I think in my rankings right now I have Edelman ahead, but I like Paris Campbell a lot. After getting 9 targets and now playing against the Vikings, honestly, I'd probably start Paris Campbell. If you want to have a shot at sneaky upside there, and just in case that game against the Seahawks doesn't go that great. I think they're both good starts this week, but I might actually try to slide Paris Campbell into my lineup. I'm trying to get him into my lineup in every single league. I have him in every league because I absolutely love him, and I was drafting him rather than waiting for him to have to be spent up in the waiver wire, and I'm glad that he showed out in week 1. Let's see if there's anything else. Yeah, AJ Brown isn't going to repeat the yards after the Cats numbers that he had last year, but he's still a beast. People made the excuse that Odell Beckham wasn't going to be able to be great after his great rookie season. He was still dominant. So even if his yards after the Cats go down, he only had 60 targets or 70 targets last year. I can't remember exactly. So as long as he can recover from this knee injury, he's still going to be very dominant. And on a team that doesn't have a lot of other playmakers in the offense outside of Derrick Henry, AJ Brown's still going to smash. So definitely hang on to him. Okay, let's talk about the last game on the slate, the Monday night game between the New Orleans Saints and the Las Vegas Raiders. Interesting game here with Michael Thomas being out. But overall, I don't think that's actually going to change the way that I feel about this game too much. Michael Thomas definitely is going to hurt the upside of the Saints, but they still have a pretty deep option or deep slate of skill position players there, and their defense is so dominant. I don't think it's really going to affect them too much. So decently high over under in this one. I was actually a little surprised by the fact that this is 49 points. Maybe Vegas is a little bit intrigued by the amount of points the Raiders put up last week. But again, remind you that the Panthers are one of the worst defenses in the league, whereas the Saints are one of the better defenses here. So don't be surprised if this one comes nowhere near that over total, unless it's the Saints running up the score on the Raiders. I think you can start to hear the undertones of my voice that I don't believe in the Raiders, even though they won in week 1. They were playing the Panthers. Let's calm down. They have 8 rookie starters on defense. That's a little hyperbolic, but it feels like that. So Saints are slated to win this one by 5.5. I'm taking the over in that one for sure, or I'm taking the Saints to cover for sure. Last week the Saints, were able to successfully slow down the Buccaneers there, made Tom Brady look pretty pedestrian, and maybe he is, but I think Tom Brady's going to show us this week that it was more the Saints defense than the Buccaneers offense that was floundering last week. So, we got Breeze. I I'm still comfortable starting Breeze in this matchup, especially. The Raiders don't really have anything scary in the secondary there. I think Breeze can still, even in a lower passing yardage week last week, he still put up 2 touchdowns. Almost had that third one with Emmanuel Sanders, just missed him. So I think Breeze can still have a pretty solid game. Not going to have like a top 5 week or anything, but I think could still end up being a top 12 decent play for you. Obviously, you're starting Alvin Kamara. Don't need me to convince you of that. I think Emmanuel Sanders will see the majority of the target game usage with Michael Thomas out. And then this is a revenge game for Jared Cook, if you guys like those narratives. If you remember, Jared Cook played for the Raiders before, so Jared Cook could have himself a day here as well. And then the Saints defense, I think, is going to put up a lot of points against the Raiders. I'm just not a big believer in them at this point. Latavius Murray, I'm still not starting until we see him actually get a decent amount of usage. This is a Kamara show. And then Traquan Smith. I want to pause and stop about Traquan Smith for a bit because he definitely has upside. So Traquan Smith is a guy who was talked about a lot in training camp, and I feel like that happens a lot, so maybe this is just a matter of he shows up in practice and doesn't show up during the game. But with Michael Thomas likely out, Traquan Smith is going to definitely need to take a step up here, and I definitely think he's worth a stash on your bench. Probably don't need to jam him into your lineup unless you're playing like a Monday night DFS slate. But Traquan Smith definitely has upside here. Emmanuel Sanders has shown us in the past that he kind of slows down as the season goes on. And I wouldn't be surprised if eventually Traquan Smith becomes the number 2 receiver here. So this might be a nice way to actually like accelerate it and get him involved in the game plan a bit more. Obviously, expect them to use Taysom Hill a bit in this game. He's not someone that you can really consider starting because he doesn't have nearly enough guaranteed workload. But I still like the Saints offense a lot in this game. Now on the Raiders side, this is where it gets a little hairy. And if you have Josh Jacobs, you're probably floored or through the roof with how he performed last week. Getting work in the passing game, which is something he never had done he got 6 targets last week. I don't think that happened a single time in 2019. Obviously 3 touchdowns, leading running back scorer on the week. Well, my issue with Josh Jacobs is the fact that from this point on until like December, his schedule is terrible against the run. I don't believe in the Raiders as a whole. I don't believe in Gruden to actually be able to lead this team to glory. So we're going to get a pretty decent picture at what Josh Jacobs actually looks like when he's playing against tougher defenses starting this week. So if you have Josh Jacobs, I was recommending that you try to sell at top dollar, get someone like Jonathan Taylor plus, try to trade for Dalvin Cook, try to trade for someone like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, someone that isn't convinced of their starter, even though they should be. And I think that would end up being a smarter play for you. But if you decide to stick it out with Jacobs, you're going to play him this week. Obviously, you can't ever consider benching him, but I'm highly concerned for the way that this game could potentially go. We will see how he is used in the passing game when the Raiders are getting beaten pretty badly. And I'm pretty sure, just based on the history of the way that the Saints play on Monday night, the way they play AFC teams, that the Saints will do pretty well in this game. If it ends up being a close contest, then we won't get that story told for us. But I'm pretty sure the Saints are going to win this one pretty handily. So we'll find out whether or not Jacobs is for real or week 1 was a mirage. You're obviously starting him, and hopefully it turns out well for you. I'm just nervous. Darren Waller as well, someone I'd definitely throw out there. He still saw the majority of his team's targets last week. I don't think that changes anytime soon. We saw O.J. Howard score a touchdown against the Saints last week. I think Waller gets in the end zone this one. Okay, Ruggs and Renfrow are the only receivers I'd be considering starting. Edwards was out there in a lot of snaps, but he saw very few targets. You're not going to start Nelson Aguilar by any means. Henry Ruggs had some of the most unrealized air yards this last week, and they were trying to use him all over the place. So I think Ruggs is a decent flex play. Not someone that I would like force into my lineup, but if you need a potential upside play, I think Ruggs can definitely do that for you. Although the Saints are a much tougher defense than the Panthers, and then Renfrow was a bit of a disappointment last week, but I wouldn't be surprised if he comes back and does decent in this one. Not looking at anyone else's way for the Raiders, but overall, I think the Saints win this one very easily. I have the Saints beating the Raiders 28-12, and that is it for the late game slate. We've gone through all 16 games this week. We'll be posting the individual games tomorrow. For those of you watching the stream, thank you. If you wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button for me, I am like 24 people away from hitting my 1,000 and becoming a YouTube partner. I've been working on that for a while, so if you wouldn't mind hitting that subscribe button for me, I would appreciate it a lot. Let's go through the rest of the questions here, if there's any other ones before I get done here. So let's see. I agree Michael Thomas needs to rest, and that's the biggest problem with high ankle sprains. You technically can come back on the field normally after about 2 weeks, but it really takes 4 to 5 weeks to completely heal. And that's why we see, like with Saquon Barkley last year, he came back, but he was not himself for like 3 weeks because he was playing through that injury. But very rarely, especially with these higher profile guys, will they actually take the time to heal in the season because there's so few games, they don't want to miss them. So my concern with Michael Thomas is he's going to come back, not be himself for like 2 or 3 weeks, but by the end of the season, he'll be fine. So don't panic if you have Michael Thomas. You know, if you had Devontae Adams last year when he had his turf toe injury, he ended up winning you leagues if you were able to scramble together enough wins. So don't panic on Michael Thomas just yet. Let's see. 49ers defense or LA Rams defense? You got to go with the 49ers playing against the worst team in the league with the Jets. Like Sam Darnold is prone to throw like 5 picks. So I wouldn't be pivoting off of any team that plays against the Jets at this point, even though the Rams defense is a decent play against that abysmal offensive line. Getting Lane Johnson and Miles Sanders back, I think the Eagles will have a little better showing this week. James Robinson or Lockett. Oh, that doesn't change anything for me. I would still go Lockett, especially in a PPR league. James Robinson is an interesting play, but the Titans are a bit stauncher of a run defense than the Colts were last week. So still playing the wait and see game with what Robinson will look like in a different game script. Good job getting Emmanuel Sanders if you have Michael Thomas. Like typically handcuffing receivers doesn't work out that well, and don't expect Emmanuel Sanders to have like 10 or 11 reception games like Michael Thomas would, but I think, you know, he's probably good for 6 or 7 targets each week, should be used in the end zone. So it should hopefully at least help bandage the couple weeks that you'll be out Michael Thomas. And if the Raiders shock the world, dude, like I'll give you guys props. I will completely change my tone. I'm just going based off of what I've seen up to this point, and yeah, which I mean, as a Raiders fan, I'm sure you know, I'm like the biggest critic of the Packers. I'm a Packers fan, so I'm not gonna sit here and act like I don't crap on my own team, but to each his own. But appreciate you guys all joining. It's fun to do these streams. We do a stream almost every night. I actually try to get to doing one every night, but check it out, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell, and join us for the next stream. Appreciate all your input, and hope you guys have a wonderful night. Good luck to you on your season or with your matchups this week. I also have rankings posted on my website. They're free this year. You can access the site for free. Click the link in the description. Just create a free account. And yeah, that's it. So thank you guys, those of you that watched, those of you that subscribed. We'll see you guys in the next video.